Hey y'all, this is the second video that I'm posting on poetry in the Bible. I made the case in the first video that if we want to understand the Bible well, we need to understand how it speaks, and that much of the time God speaks poetry. And if we don't understand poetry or how it works, we won't understand or appreciate much of the Bible. And I think a lot of times there's a lot of misunderstanding of the Bible because we don't discern that sometimes the Bible is using poetic language and we just haven't paid attention to how that works. And so it's important for us to learn how biblical poetry works, to understand how God conveys meaning and how God has chosen human speech, in particular human speech from the time and place that it came to convey the things that he wants to say. I think when we think of poetry, some of the things we often think of are rhyme or meter. And what's interesting about biblical poetry is it has neither one of those. It doesn't rhyme sounds, and there's really not a very consistent meter. So I want to talk today about two of what I think are the biggest hallmarks of biblical poetry, and hopefully these help us understand Scripture better. So the most important element of biblical poetry is what people call parallelism, which doesn't convey a lot of meaning, although it does seem to suggest things in parallel. Here's how I would describe parallelism. It's the putting together of two lines, sometimes three, but for our purposes we'll say two, in order to deepen or heighten meaning. Okay, so two lines will be put together, and those two lines will somehow expand on one another. One of the things parallelism is not is just saying the same thing twice. A line of poetry in general is meant to make us slow down and pay attention and see what's going on. And this function of parallelism is to do just that. It's to put two lines together and to make us think about what is going on in the putting together of those two lines. Sometimes it's intensifying the meaning of the first line. Sometimes it's contrasting with the meaning of the first line. But in general, we should be asking, what does putting these two lines together do? So I'm going to use some examples from Psalm 23, the most famous psalm. So you see right away an example of parallelism. It's all through it, but in the first line. The Lord is my shepherd, first line. Second line, I shall not want. So notice what these two parallels are doing. It's not just saying the same thing twice. It's saying, well, God is my shepherd, and it's using this image of shepherding. And we might almost supply the word therefore. The second line is giving us a therefore. If God is my shepherd, I'm not going to suffer need. All right, so in that line, it's intensifying and adding to the meaning. So we could ask, okay, what does it mean for the Lord to be my shepherd? It means I'm not going to have needs, or my needs will be met. Another example, and again, almost every verse of Psalm 23 has parallelism, but another example, just to give you an idea of a different kind of parallel. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. So the first line is, you prepare a table before me, sounds good, and then, in the presence of my enemies. What are these two lines doing together? I would suggest the first line is giving us a sense of, okay, God provides for me, that's a good thing. And the second line surprises us, in the presence of my enemies. But when you put those two lines together, it suggests, well, even in the presence of my enemies, you care for me, and therefore I'm safe. So these two lines together they kind of give us a surprise. But again, they intensify the meaning of what it means to be cared for by God. So again, we should always pay attention to parallelism, and good translations will often put the lines in parallel for you. So ESV does this. Some other translations will show you the parallels so you can pay attention to them. But we should always ask, what does putting these two lines together do to the meaning they're conveying? And take time to answer that question. Okay, the second thing I want to say about biblical poetry, or the second maybe structuring tool that the Bible uses, is something called chiasmus or chiasm. And this is a little harder to understand. It's easier to visualize, but it's the structuring of statements in stair-step fashion, where you have an A section at the beginning and an A section at the end. and then a B section second, and a matching B section at the end, and C, and so forth, until you get to a central section. And the purpose of this structuring is often to emphasize the central point. All of the content is important, but it's often framing everything to climax in that central section. So whereas sometimes in English prose writing, we might say that the main point is at the end, or maybe the main point's first, the main point in a chiasm is usually right in the middle. And I'll give you some illustrations to help you understand it. But I want to say that in this happens all over the Old Testament. It happens in the New Testament because many of the writers of the New Testament were Jewish, and so they thought in these stair-step fashions. It can occur on a very small scale. So I am my beloved's, and he is mine. That's a very small scale. I am my beloved's, and he is mine. And it's also an example of parallelism. The central section is him, and I and me are the outer sections. It can occur at a macro level, at a huge level. So for example, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are in stair step. Genesis and Deuteronomy are sort of paired together. Exodus and Numbers are paired together and have similar themes. And the central section is Leviticus. And so I think that what that tells us, among other things, is that worship and drawing near to God is at the center of the 5 books of Moses. So again, it can occur at a sentence level. It can occur at the level of the whole canon of Scripture. So let me illustrate chiasm now with Psalm 23. So I would suggest that if we were drawing this out, the first section, the first bookend section, the A section on either side is, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. There's A. And then the other matching A is from the end, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I would suggest the 2 things that are matching in there is the Lord, which is God's name, Yahweh. It only occurs at the beginning and end of the poem, and so it's speaking about my relationship to Yahweh, that he's my shepherd and I'm going to dwell in his house. The B section has to do with food and drink. So the first B section is, he makes me lie down in green pastures, he leads me beside still waters. God provides food and drink for me as my shepherd. The matching section at the end is, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. So again, we have food and drink provided, but with the image of a banquet instead of the image of a sheep. The C section, as we progress along the pyramid, has to do with security. So the first one says, he restores my soul, he leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And then the matching section towards the latter half of the poem, or of the psalm, says, you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. So it puts together his restoration of my life with the rod and the staff. And that brings us to the central section, which I think is the culmination and the central emphasis of Psalm 23, which is, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. So the emphasis that this chiastic structure gives us is that it doesn't matter what's happening to me, Yahweh is with me, and therefore I will ultimately be safe. And that means all kinds of things, like he provides for me, and he gives me security and discipline and whatnot. So these are just some of the ways that the Bible some of the tools the Bible repeatedly uses to convey the information or to draw the picture that it wants to draw. And may these tools be helpful in helping us understand what it is that God's wanting to say to us through his word.